Okay, let's begin. Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar, Managing External Access for Teams. My name is Sam Iden, I'm the ProvisionPoint Marketing Manager. I'm here today to be watching out for questions in the chat, so as we go along, feel free to type any questions in the chat box as we go, and I'll save them for the end, and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end for you. Peter Baddeley, the ProvisionPoint CEO, is going to be leading today's webinar. It's the usual format today with a little bit of theory, a practical demonstration, and then some questions at the end. If we're all set, Peter, are you ready to take it away?
Yes, I am. Thank you, Sam. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear you all good.
Perfect. Great. Thank you very much. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar today. So as Sam said, we'll just start off with a little bit around the problem space and a little bit of an understanding of how ProvisionPoint 365 helps. And then we'll dive into a demonstration, a few slides to wrap up, and then an opportunity to ask questions at the end. Feel free to post those questions to Sam during the course of the webinar, and he'll collect them all up for me towards to answer towards the end. So I guess let's start with the problem around external access. I get asked questions almost every day about access to SharePoint, Teams, or Microsoft 365 more generally. And these are just a couple of examples of the common questions which I get asked. Who has access to X team, X site? So my project site, my finance site, my partner site, whatever it might be. What access does have access to my tenant? So what access does Peter have to my tenant? What access does Sam have to my tenant? And then who has access to a specific file? So where you've got a file, maybe some sales information, some brochures, some press releases or other things like that, which you've allowed to be externally shared, who has access to that? So in terms of putting this webinar together, as well as some recent blog posts which we published, I actually sort of sat down and thought about, well, what does external access mean? And there's a Microsoft article linked at the end of this particular slide, which I thought actually explained it really neatly and broke it down into a number of different areas. And I think that partially poses the challenge, understanding and thinking about these different areas. So what can we do? Well, we can collaborate on documents, which is all about sharing files out of our sites, our teams, our OneDrive with individuals or anonymously, and providing a link for them to either come and read or edit that specific file. So sharing links. The next two are fairly similar, but just in terms of different platforms. So firstly, it's allowing guest users to come into our SharePoint sites and work within the context of our SharePoint site. So access documents, access lists, access pages of information, but using an external login. And then the next one is about collaboration within our team. So allowing an external guest full access to our team, potentially excluding the private channels, to collaborate with the full features of Teams. So that's, chat, tasks, files, etc. So we're inviting users, and they can either log on with their Microsoft 365 account from their tenant, or they can use a Microsoft account, whether that's attached to something like an Outlook.com or even a different domain as well. Finally, and the new one, which is obviously still in preview at the moment, which is collaborating with external parties in an individual channel using the new capabilities around shared channels, which Microsoft, as I say, have just released into preview. So I think that neatly explains the different types of collaboration, but around external access. But that doesn't necessarily help us solve the problem. Just to sort of pick up on a couple of those things if you're not familiar with them. Firstly, that file sharing concept. So you may well have seen this in OneDrive or in individual sites you're working in. That ability to share a file. It's not exclusively to do with external sharing. You can share an individual file internally as well with people who don't have access to that site. But the contexts around this for external sharing is being able to either share it to anyone, an anonymous link, or sharing it to new or known guest users. Speaking of guests, that is where we can add an individual who's not part of our tenant to our site or team. And dependent on the nature of that ad, if they already exist in our tenant, they've already been invited as a guest to another site or another team, we can merely add them and then they're being granted access to that site or team. Alternatively, if they had no access to our tenant, then it's sort of two things in one. It's going to go through a process of creating a guest user account in Azure Active Directory, which they authenticate against, normally using either their Microsoft 365 account or Microsoft account credentials, and then granting them access to that additional site and team. And at that point, they then are a guest and they can be added to other sites and teams. So what's the problem here? Well, on the left is actually a statement actually from the same Microsoft article I mentioned earlier, which says, by default, sharing with people outside your organization using guest access or anonymous access is enabled. The sort of default experience when you create your new tenant is it's all turned on. You know, Microsoft 365 as a platform has increasingly been pushing collaboration, making it easy for people to work together. That's what platforms like Teams especially are designed for. It should be easy for you to create a space, share those files with external people, work, chat, collaborate. It's how that Microsoft can position themselves against the competition like Slack, Dropbox, Box, etc. Now, in most cases, you want to empower users to be able to do that. There will be scenarios where you've got sensitive or personal information which you don't want shared. But if you turn it off blanket, which is an option, then where are they going to go to share and collaborate on files? Are they going to log into someone else's tenant? Are they going to go and use another service to work with? These sort of scenarios is when you then lose control. So ultimately, you want this data in Microsoft 365, but you need some controls around it while still giving the users that self-service capability. And so that's very much what ProvisionPoint 365 is all designed about. We've actually got two products. Firstly, ProvisionPoint Workspaces, which is the end-to-end workspace governance for services like Microsoft Teams, SharePoint sites, groups, planner plans, Yammer communities. So creation, ongoing compliance checks, and ultimately archiving with lifecycle policies. And then we've got our permission app, which allows the end-to-end permission management of our SharePoint sites and teams. So detailed reporting, management of change, so changing permissions, as well as reporting on things like shared files, guest users. And I'm going to touch on four concepts. The sort of product suite lets you do so many more things, but obviously we're focusing around external access today. So I'm going to look at granular security control at the point of request, how we can actually give users the ability to decide when sites and teams should be externally shared and when they shouldn't, how we can maybe drive that based on other decision making like sensitivity. We're going to show you how to quickly report on guests and sharing links within our sites and teams. So where we've already got the stuff created, how can we quickly discover where there's potential problems? We're then going to look at how we can manage and track changes to external access. It's not always the case that we want something externally shared at the very beginning of its life cycle. We might need to change that and enable that or disable that at certain points. So again, how can we empower users to be able to do that? And then finally, we're going to look at, well, how do we actually manage a complex estate of sites and teams? How can we ensure that those continually are controlled, external access is managed throughout the life cycle of those teams before it's ultimately archived? And hopefully in this demo, which I'm about to go through, it's going to give you some ideas of how we can help you, but also a broader flavor of the capabilities of the platform. So let's jump into a demo. So as I said, I've got four things to show you today. So I'm going to start off as a user called Adele. So she's my end user scenario. She's the person who wants to create a new site or team. And she can do that through the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app. She's got access to that on her app launcher. Here it is inside our web experience. And for those using Teams and primarily focused in Teams, you can access it within Teams as well. To create a new site or team, I can come to the Request tab and I will have access to certain templates which my organization have configured for me and define that I'm able to request. So instead of just having a single template or a single option to create a team, I've got some options here. If I want an internal team, I can select that. I've got defined things like sensitivity labels, privacy, guest access settings, all predefined. If I want an externally enabled team, I can choose that with different settings around it. And these are just the templates I've configured. You may well have a number of different scenarios you want to manage around different sharing settings for a specific site or team. Equally, they don't have to be called internal, external. You could say like, this is where we create our projects, and external sharing happens to be enabled. This is where you create, sensitive projects, and predefined settings are set up. So we're giving the users some choices, but we're implementing controls on top of that. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to go, actually, I'd like to create a new externally shared project. I can't change any of these settings. We can give users the option to change them, but I can't. I'm presented and defined a lease. That's our lifecycle policy. That's going to expire our team after a period of time. So it might be that externally shared sites and teams are archived off much more frequently, much quicker than maybe something which is for internal use. I can capture key business metadata as well, which helps with things like naming, classification of those teams, can also be used for reporting purposes as well. So really useful things if we're looking to track our teams which have maybe been shared with external parties. We can also define here key users who are responsible for that team, defining things like multiple owners, who our project team is, members, or whatever permissions we're assigning to the site or team. Now, when I go ahead and request this team, we have the option with each of our templates to allocate an approval process. And in this case, because this team is going to be have the ability to share it with guest users, I want to ensure that someone checks and approves that. It might be that we don't require approval for internally facing sites or teams, or we might just have a different approval path. We've seen scenarios where customers introduce a second check by a compliance or a security team if something's going to be externally shared. Now I'm just going to switch over to the other user I'm using for my demo today, which is Megan. She's one of the administrators, and she's also one of the approvers. You can define whatever approval rules you want. You can route it to specific groups of people like compliance teams, or maybe just to the user's manager would be appropriate. Megan will receive an email notification similar to this. All of our notifications are customizable. And she will also receive a notification within the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app. I can go in and action that approval. I can see all the details of the request, and I can then make my choices whether I'm going to approve or reject the request. Now that's how we can introduce some simple controls around creating a team which is externally shared. It doesn't have to go through a help desk ticket where someone in IT will then go off and create that site or team 3 days later. It's something which my end user Adele can request immediately. She can make choices, but we can put that approval step in place to make sure that it's properly authorized before it gets shared. So that's sort of step one, that requesting a team. Next, I wanted to have a little look into reporting. So I've got a SharePoint site here. It's also a Microsoft team as well. So I'll have a look at it from the team's perspective in a minute. So if you've already got a number of sites and teams created, or that you can continue to create those sites and teams using ProvisionPoint Workspaces, then we make a number of reports available through our ProvisionPoint Permissions app. Now we can do all sorts of discovery reports about permissions, but we do include several specific reports related to external users. So firstly, anywhere within our site, whether that's within the site itself or within specific document libraries, Site owners and administrators can quickly run reports to say, show me where those documents which have been shared externally via links. That might be to specific individuals. So where I've got a marketing campaign document and that's shared with a specific user, and I can actually drill in and see who that user is, or where it's shared via an anonymous sharing link as well. With any of these links, I can quickly select them and remove them. That is incredibly quick in comparison. If anyone's familiar with trying to work out where sharing links are, you're probably looking at about 5 or 6 clicks per file to even prove if they've got a sharing link or not. So a lot of work involved. So quickly can discover where those links are. I have other reports available to me. So any of my reports I can either run on my individual site I'm working with, or I can run against multiple sites. So if I've got an ask to say, show me all the sharing links within my tenant, I can quickly run that sort of report. I can also run reports here on external users, so I can see any users which are external access, so any guest users. And again, I've got options to come and remove those external users. Finally, in the context of what we're talking about today, and you'll see there are many other reports here, I can even run a report on a specific user. So if I wanted to drill into Peter, who's one of the external users, I can come in here and see what different permissions he's got, what membership he has within my site, or even running that across multiple sites and teams, so I can get a full view of his level of access. I mentioned that whilst we can access that in SharePoint, we can also access that in Teams. So we can access it via our Teams app to run reports across an individual team. So here we can come and run those same sorts of reports looking at external users, or again, I could run it across all of my different teams. Again, I can choose to make this app available just to my administrators or to individual team owners as well. So that's a little bit about permission reporting. The third thing I was going to talk to you today about was how we request changes to specific sites or teams and their external access. So let's just switch back briefly to Adele and look at this site here, the Fabricam project site. In ProvisionPoint workspaces, I can come and request changes to a workspace around a number of different things. I can request new structure, new channels, manage owners, members, and I can also request changes to how that workspace is secured. And I can come in here to privacy, and I can have a number of different actions enabled for me. These actions allow me to make certain changes. So for example, I can request a change to my external sharing settings. So at the moment, files can be shared within my site or team. I can come in here and I can request a change to it. I can submit that change. And that action will then run and it will make that change. I could have introduced an approval against that as well. So Megan or another authorized user would approve that request for a change. Any changes will be recorded on my timeline. So I can come in here and I can see a history of the changes which have been occurred, whether those are actioned by an individual like Adele or automatic processes which we've got scheduled to run. As an administrator, Megan can configure how those actions are used. So she can go into a template and she can configure which actions owners of teams or sites are able to use. So for example, she can go in and define whether they can change guest access, whether they can change external sharing, privacy, sensitivity label. So an ability to come in and request how and who and the nature of that team is used in terms of who can have access. You can also attach approval to many of these actions, as well as notifications. So you can get quite granular in control. Remember, these setups of actions can be different for different templates. So if you don't want people to make changes to certain sites and teams, then you can put those restrictions in place based on the action model. And this is all about delegation to authorized owners of teams. The last thing which I want to talk to you today is about what happens outside of these things. What happens beyond the initial request, beyond requests for changes, and before this will ultimately be archived by one of our lifecycle policies. And that's where our compliance policy feature comes in. So if we go to a specific template, we can attach what we call compliance policies. And I picked the wrong one. So if we go in here and we can go to here, we can attach something called a compliance policy. And a compliance policy is something which runs on a scheduled basis, and it will run various checks based on what we configure as rules. And those rules can include checking to see if the sharing settings are not what you've defined as an organization. It might be that there are owners attached to the site or team who have been disabled, blocked in AD, and so they're no longer there to manage the team. Probably they've left the organization. And we can check on other things as well, such as privacy or naming conventions. And it's looking essentially for a non-compliance and then giving you a range of actions which occur. We can come in and define our various compliance policies, and we can set various rule sets which we want to use. Each one of these rules can do various things. And as I mentioned, we've got a range of rules available to configure. Every single rule will have the option to notify you. So notify designated users that there's a problem, or store that information for future reporting. And then dependent on the nature of the rule, it will then have some sort of setting which allows you to reset that non-compliance to a compliant state. So to give you an example here of the one which I'm looking at and working with, this will report actually if there are any teams where my external sharing setting is not only people in your organization. So it will run against all teams associated with the specific template the compliance policy is linked to. And then it will also store that fact. So it will store it and notify me. It might be that I would have other things where maybe I reset that. So if I found any workspaces where it was set as existing guests or new guests, it would actually reset that to what I now considered compliant. Now I'm only going to run my compliance check across a few workspaces today, but where the power really comes in is when you're running it across tens or hundreds or thousands of workspaces to ensure that ongoing compliance. And as an administrator, I can go and look at these policies in an area called the job queue. So this is where all different actions occur. And here's one which ran yesterday evening, which I can see that it was 25% compliant. So it ran against 4 workspaces. And if I drill into that, I can then see some details about the different checks it did. So it will check to see if there's any disabled owners, and then it will store and notify me about any external sharing settings which don't match that only an organization. I can drill into that to actually see the details. So I can then go and look at ones which are compliant and ones which are non-compliant. So for example, in this scenario, it was non-compliant because we could see that the compliance settings were existing guests only. Whereas this specific one, AdventureWorks, we can see it's fully compliant. It passed all the tests, so there were no disabled owners. External sharing was what we expected it to be. And we can even then see a history of those checks to see that maybe previously it was either non-compliant or compliant, and then that's now changed based on some action happening. And that's that 4th area where we can help you with the compliance policies. So to quickly wrap up today, I've got a few slides to go through, just reviewing those things which I've shown you. So firstly, we talked about provisioning, which gives you that granular security control at the point of request. It lets you control which teams, which sites are enabled for external access, and can introduce approval processes where appropriate. Secondly, we looked at reporting and how we can report on your state of different sites and teams, understand where there are external access points. We then looked at actions which allow requests to change. So delegating again the ability to control when workspaces are shared with external parties, when file sharing links can be sent. And finally, we just looked at compliance policies, which deals with those gaps, those things where non-compliant things may have occurred, or maybe your just view of it has changed and you want to run a policy to check that things are compliant and then take appropriate actions based on non-compliance. And that, I think I said it would take about 20 to 25 minutes, so that's perfect. That brings us towards the end of our webinar. I've got a couple of things to summarize in terms of a wrap up, but let's hand it over back to Sam and he'll see if we've got any questions today.
Yeah, hi Peter. We've got a couple of questions. First one here is, if I've already got several hundred teams, how does that work with ProvisionPoint?
Yeah, so that's actually really good, because that links to my next slide, which is, we hear this a lot, you know, obviously during things like the pandemic, people had to roll out teams fairly rapidly. ProvisionPoint has an API, so we can import your existing sites and teams into the app, into our directory. We don't make any changes to those at the point of import. We let you apply a lifecycle policy, so if you want to start archiving teams which aren't being used, you can do that. You can then start using actions to make changes around your external access. You can use our reporting app to report on permissions. And finally, you can then start to run compliance policies to check that those sites and teams meet what you want as a compliance policy. So there's lots of options for how we can help you with that. And actually, I was talking with a couple of customers about something very similar this morning.
Good stuff. Thanks for that. And the other question we've had for is, how does the product manage with regular updates from Microsoft?
Yes. So again, we get asked about that an awful lot as well. So we're regularly updating the app. We tend to release it an update about every 4 to 6 weeks. That's obviously driven by a lot of what Microsoft is introducing, new features which Microsoft are including, but also it's based on customer feedback. We work with our customers very closely, as well as a trusted network of partners. So we're driven by, yes, absolutely what Microsoft is bringing forwards, and we're regularly updating it, but also we're looking at, well, how do customers want to govern a specific feature? And we're looking at how we build that into our apps.
Excellent, thanks for that. Yeah, that's all the questions that we have for now.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I've just got one final slide to wrap up with, which is just in summary, we've only sort of shown you a small piece of ProvisionPoint 365 today. We focused around external access, but I think it neatly illustrates how we can help organizations. Firstly, it's in terms of that full lifecycle management of sites and teams, from creation through compliance policies, actions, and ultimately expiry with the lease. We're very much about empowering users with self-service governance. So how do we actually let users request things, make changes themselves? And then finally, we look to give admins and compliance managers the tools they need, the reports they need, the controls they need, which gives them the confidence to control things. And with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'll switch back to Sam to see if there's any more questions, and we'll be online for another minute or two to answer any of those.
Yeah, we just had one more question come through. It says, do we need to disable users' existing ability to create and manage teams?
Yeah, so no, it's not required to use the ProvisionPoint Workspaces app, but typically most organizations do that because if you provide a mechanism for people to create sites and teams outside of a governance solution like ProvisionPoint, then obviously you can't ensure that your governance settings are applied. However, equally, we do have some customers which continue to let their users create sites and teams outside of ProvisionPoint workspaces. A couple of examples: they let users create internally managed teams straight in Teams, but anything external needs to go through ProvisionPoint workspaces. Or others ensure that we work with them to ensure that those sites and teams are regularly imported into the app, and they're much more focused on ongoing life cycle and compliance. So I would say in 80–90% of scenarios, people do lock that down because they want the end-to-end control, but there are scenarios, dependent on your use case, where you might not want to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Peter.
Okay, I think that's all the questions. We are recording the video, so if you will get a copy of that recording sent out to you in the next couple of days. And if any of your colleagues weren't able to attend, then they'll be able to access that recording as well. Otherwise, if there's no other questions, I'll say thank you. Like I said, the meeting will be open for about another minute or two. So if you've got anything else, feel free to reach out. Otherwise, contact us directly, either via your account manager if you're an existing customer or partner, or via all the various contact details via our website or social media.